Good evening, everyone. This is Shane Gebauer with BrushyMtnBeeFarm. I'm the general manager. This evening tonight we'll be talking about 6 weeks as a beekeeper. Now what? And joining me this evening is Kim Flottum with Bee Culture Magazine. For those of you that don't know Kim, he's certainly someone that you ought to put on your radar. He's probably one of the most traveled people that I know of. He's also done and does more for this industry of anyone else that I know about. He's constantly talking to people, trying to figure out problems. He's a wealth of information, and truly an honor to have him here with us this evening. And if you haven't checked out his magazine, Bee Culture Magazine, you ought to do that as well. That's my shameless plug for his magazine, but it really is an excellent resource for anyone who's keeping bees. It's got a lot of very good practical information in it, which can be utilized in your day-to-day beekeeping. Before we get started, I would like to, for our benefit, just launch a couple of poll questions here. I want to make sure that we have a good understanding of where people are coming from in terms of their experience. So I just would like to launch this here. This is how did you start your first colony of bees? We're going to focus largely on packaged bees this evening, but we also want to get an understanding of where people got started, whether it was a package, a nuke, or caught a wild swarm. I've got 76% of you voting right now. Whoa, sorry about that. 85% voting. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and I'll go ahead and close that. And just so you can see the results of that, we've got 61% starting with packaged bees, 31 with a nucleus hive, and 8% caught a wild swarm. And I've got one more poll for you. Let me just show you this one. If you would, again, just for our own benefit, have you taken a beekeeping class? Do you have a mentor? Do you belong to a beekeeping association? Just go ahead and check all that apply. You can select more than one answer here. And again, this is just to sort of help us gain some understanding of where folks are coming from and the background and experience levels that you all have. I've got 87% of you voting. I'm going to go ahead and close that poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm closing that poll right now, and just again, so we can all see where we stand. We've got 73% have taken a beekeeping class, 52% have a mentor, which is great. That's actually higher than I was anticipating. And 72% belong to a beekeeping association. That's also much higher than I was anticipating. So that's just absolutely wonderful to see. So I'll go ahead and close that up. I just want to check one thing. Okay, good. Just doing a quick technology check there. So tonight we're talking about 6 weeks as a beekeeper. Now what? And here are some things that we're going to be covering. In this order, we're going to be talking about feeding, some queen assessment and quality, brood inspection, Varoa monitoring and implications, and also how to go about supering when you add the next layer, the brood chamber, etc., things like that. We'll be talking about that as well. So first, let's talk about feeding. There's two schools of thought here, and that is that once people, or once the nectar flow starts, that you remove all the feed off that colony. But I think, and Kim, you can chime in here, but I'm of the school of thought that you ought to feed these bees up until that nectar flow, then pull off your syrup, but you've got to watch them. It's not good enough to just say the nectar flow is going on, the faucets are on, they're bringing in nectar, they're bringing in pollen, the colony's sort of on autopilot. Because I'm sort of haunted by the memories of last year where I was getting phone calls from people in June saying my colony's starving because they were under the assumption that June is a fairly good month for nectar flow. And so I don't necessarily need to be concerned about the resources in my colony in terms of syrup or pollen, protein, things like that. And as a result, their colony strength weakened, the overall health weakened, and they spent all summer long trying to recover from that. So while certainly once you add honey supers, I think it's important to pull off your feeder so you're not simply storing sugar water or corn syrup in your honey supers, but you definitely have to be mindful of what might be happening out there in nature. You definitely have to watch to ensure that they're still adding resources to the colony, not depleting them. And I think that that's a trap that many beekeepers can fall into, that June comes, all is good. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, Shane, first off, thanks for inviting me here tonight, and shameless commercial announcements always accepted. Appreciate that. I like your comment on feeding. I think I probably would only add, just for background, is that since a lot of you have started with packages and even nukes, this time of year, a package, even a nuke, is still living hand to mouth. Everything that they bring in, they're either turning into wax or baby bees, and they're although they may be storing a little bit of it, they're not storing a lot of times. And 3 days of rain, we're going to have 4 days of rain here this week here in my part of Ohio. 4 days of rain, and those packages haven't got anything coming in, and it's still going out full speed making brood and making wax. So what I try to do, and I sometimes suggest that people do, is keep a feeder on, but cut back the amount of sugar you're putting in it. You know, you can, instead of a 1-to-1, a half to one. Excuse me. Just so you've got something there, so that if you get 4 days of rain and you don't get out there because it's raining to get some feed on, or to check them anyway, at least they've got something coming in, and they're not going to starve while you're inside waiting for it to quit raining. And I think the same goes true. You got a picture of a pollen patty there. Absolutely, a pollen patty on there. It's the cheapest insurance you can ever put on your colony. If they don't have protein coming in, they got a lot of young to feed, and you get 4 days of rain, 5 days of rain, cool weather, bingo, they still got food coming in. They can still take care of the kids.
Still take care of the kids. You know, and you were mentioning about all the resources that are going into sort of growing that colony. If we look at our next picture here, you know, the general rule of thumb that I always hear, of course the numbers vary a little bit depending on who you talk to, but the rule of thumb that I've heard is that it takes about 7 to 8 pounds of honey to produce 1 pound of wax. And so this is a brand new frame and foundation that was put into a colony this year. And you can see over in this corner here that they're just now getting into that corner. So they're really just beginning to draw out this frame. And so there's a lot of resources going in to draw this comb to get it to the point where either your queen can be laying eggs in it, or the bees can be storing pollen or nectar in it. And that's a lot of resources that these bees need to invest in, sort of just infrastructure, to ensure they've got space to do what they need to do. And so that was a really good segue into that picture. And
just a second. Excuse me, Shane, I just want to throw in one number.
Yeah.
You figure it's 8 pounds of wax. That's 40 pounds of nectar that those bees have to bring back to make a pound of wax.
That's pretty staggering. It's pretty, especially when you mix it in with another statistic that that your average bee over the course of her lifetime only brings in collects enough nectar to produce a drop of honey that would fit on most people's pinky nail. It's about I think 1/10 of a teaspoon over the course of her lifetime. So you can see how much energy is really going into growing this colony. And I think that that's something that's often overlooked by people getting started, is that there's a lot of time and energy and resources going in to grow this colony just to get it to the point that it can survive winter. What do you want to say about the queens here, Kim?
Well, if I could put all of the things that can go wrong at this time of year with a package, about 80% of them would sit with that bug on the left there. She's critical to everything that's going on, and making sure that she stays doing her job is probably the most important chore you have as a beekeeper now, even if you can't find her, which isn't uncommon with somebody that's just starting out and somebody that's been doing it for 30 years. I spent 2 hours looking for one last weekend. But knowing what the queen should be doing right now and being able to look at your colony and see, yes, this is what's going on, and it's either correct or incorrect, and then being able to move from there, I think is going to be critical to success all the rest of the summer into the winter, because bees need a colony needs a good foundation. Bad pun, sorry, but if something goes wrong with a queen, and there are so many things that can go wrong with her right now, your colony's off to a bad start, and they just never seem to catch up if they get slowed down now. So you want to take a look at what can go wrong, Shane?
Absolutely.
On the right, you're seeing, well, the first question is everybody good at finding eggs? And that's always a trick, and it takes a while to get comfortable with looking at a frame, where the eggs should be on a frame, and then looking into the cell with the sun behind your back and tilting the frame just a little bit. And I don't know if you found this secret out or not. When you're looking down into a cell and you get the sun just right over your shoulder, just about midday, a little before, a little after, the sun goes right down in there, and you tilt the frame, you can see the shadow move of the egg standing up on end. Try that trick if you haven't mastered that already. It makes you don't even have to see the egg. You see the shadow move, and that can make it easier sometimes. But on the right is what you're looking at, a queen putting egg right down in the very center of the cell, adds a little glue to the bottom so it stands upright. Excuse me, and that's the pretty picture. That's what you want to be seeing. We're going to get into how many you should be seeing here in a moment, but one of the things that can go wrong in your colony is, for reasons, 100 different kinds of reasons, your queen disappears. She's a no-show. She either quits and they get rid of her, or she just quits and they don't get rid of her, but she's still there. Any number of things can happen. But what happens after, Shane, about 10 days to 2 weeks? It takes maybe not even that long.
Well, I've heard longer than that, because I guess it's worth mentioning that we're talking about a laying worker here.
Right.
On the left. That's the slide. The picture we're seeing there is a result of a laying worker. I've heard 3 weeks, because it takes a while for the brood pheromone to dissipate as well, and it's the brood pheromone and the queen pheromone together that sort of suppress the reproductive system of the workers. That's what I've heard.
So somewhere in that too long a period that you weren't looking at your bees.
That's a good point.
Because the old argument is, don't get in your bees so much, because you disrupt them and you disturb them and you mess up their. At the same time, how do you know what's going on if you're not in there? And it ends up being a balance between your curiosity and wanting to know what's going on, and leaving the bees alone. And I don't have a problem with twice a week going into a hive when you're first getting started. There's a chance you're going to have a problem rolling the queen or something like that, but boy, you'll never find this if you're in there looking at what's going on. But what you're seeing here on the left is, at some point after the queen and her queen pheromone disappears, there are some workers in the colony whose ovaries develop to the point where they can produce eggs that only produce drones. Now, excuse me, one of the things that you need to know is there are always laying workers in a colony. There's always a few. And at some point you may see 2 or 3 cells with a bunch of eggs in them. I guarantee you come back the next day and they're gone. There may be only 1 egg or no eggs left. But there's always a tiny population of laying workers in the colony. But when you see something like this, when every cell's got a bunch of eggs, you've got several maybe many laying workers, and then you've got a real problem going on your hands. How do you deal with this, Shane? What's your technique?
Well, you know, that's a good question. We had Jennifer Berry on here last week, and we were talking about different methods, and we talked a little bit about the most common one that I hear that I really question how effective it is the one where you basically dismantle your hive, you carry the equipment 100 feet away or so, you shake all the bees off, you bring the equipment back to its original location and reassemble things. And the thought is that, of course, your foragers that know where their hive is located will return, but that laying worker, in theory, is sort of stranded out there in the middle of nowhere, not knowing how to get home. I don't think that works very well.
I agree.
I think the best way is the method that Jennifer suggested, which is either taking frames of brood, putting it into that colony, and introducing a queen with that brood. Or the other method is we actually had someone here at work that had a laying worker situation, and what we do is take a board that covers up the top of the hive but is open in the center, and you just set a nuke on top of that with some newspaper. And so you've basically got all the brood up there, you've got a laying queen, and they chew through the newspaper and the queen sort of assimilates into that hive. But both methods are sort of accomplishing the same thing, introducing brood and introducing a good, thriving, healthy queen.
It's always helpful if you have an additional colony. When you don't have a colony, it gets really tricky. But I think the phrase that I like to use that sort of sticks in your mind is you overwhelm the colony with open brood, not sealed brood, right? Mm-hmm. Open brood. You just overwhelm it.
That's right.
And you end up with so much influence from the open brood that the influence of the laying workers is diminished. To be quick, I'll go back to the common recommendation of dismantling the colony and dumping the bees out 100 yards. Remember that there's always some laying workers in the colony, and they're foragers when they're not laying. So foragers can fly.
Yeah.
You're not having bees that are just sticking around being laying workers. They're going to lay sometimes, and they're out foraging other times. They're a normal worker when it comes to the activities in the hive that they're doing. Plus, so yeah, overwhelming with brood.
Yeah, I think that's the best way. But if you don't have so that raises the question. A lot of people that are listening, I suspect, only have one colony. What do? You don't have a colony to raise
exactly.
Brood. What do you do?
Exactly. If you have no access to any other colonies, if you don't have a buddy, what did you have? About 50% of the people have a mentor, and 70-some% are in an association. With those kind of contacts, finding a way to solve this problem, doing this thing with the brood, begins to be possible, because if you explain the situation, you're likely to find someone who goes, okay, I can do this for you, I can sell you a hive, I can sell you some brood, I can give you some brood, fix the situation, and we'll settle up later on, give me a jar of honey or something later on down the road. But if you only got one colony and you can't find any other source of brood, you can try requeening. I think that's throwing good money after bad. But that's probably the only thing you can try, is to put a new queen in that situation and hope that she's accepted, which is really questionable.
So, Kim, I'm going to do something that I usually don't do. I'll always give shameless plugs to guest speakers, but normally I won't give one for myself. But I will do one in this case. And the only reason I'm doing this is because someone during Jennifer's webinar posted this, that our requeening frame, this person had very good luck introducing queens into a laying worker colony using our requeening frame, which basically is a glorified queen cage. It just gives more area for that queen to roam around. More bees have access to her as a result, and thus her pheromone spreads through that colony, and you can contain her in that frame for a longer period of time until the reproductive systems of those workers are suppressed a little bit. And you'll have much greater success in that queen being accepted than if you just simply pop in a queen cage with her in it. So forgive me, everyone listening, for that shameless plug. Normally, I
think that shameless plug's a good idea. I wouldn't have thought of that. I would have thought of a pushing cage, but I've used your other cage.
The pushing cages, they work okay, but what I found with them is oftentimes they mine through the wax comb to get into that cage before the effect of having that queen sort of in there for a prolonged period of time really takes effect. With a queen introduction frame, you determine when she releases. There's no way for them to do it when they want to. They can't mine through comb. It's a frame that she's contained in until you pull the plug, essentially. But those push-in cages work okay. If in situations, I think, where there's not a laying worker, but maybe just a difficult hive to requeen. Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Good idea.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we've beaten laying workers to death. Let's take a look at this one, where we've got some bees tending some brood. You wanted to do math. You wanted to talk about brood math here. What do you have for us?
Well, first off, when you're looking at what's going on in this picture, I hope that the people listening have been able to see this going on, and you've been able to see different stages of brood, little tiny, barely able to see them in the bottom of the cell, to the point where they're huge and standing up and getting ready to pupate. So you've seen all stages by now. After 6 weeks, you should have seen all stages, all up to sealed. And right now, after about 3 weeks, 3.5 weeks after you've established your colony, maybe as much as 4, and maybe even, depending on the weather, as much as 5 weeks, you should be seeing your first flush of adults emerge from your queen. Going all the way back to, if you figure that she probably didn't do much the first week she was in there. She was in her cage for 3 or 4 or 5 days. Once she was released, it took her a couple days to get her bearings and get going, get up to speed with lots of good food. So she probably didn't start laying until she'd been in that colony about a week. Then it takes her another week, another weekish, how's that as a term, to get going in terms of up to what a good daily rate is going to be. We've all heard the term that bees can lay 2,000 up to 2,000 eggs a day, and that's a number that I'm going to show you in a minute how to figure out. But some good estimates are that the first week that she lays eggs, she's in the 2,000 to 3,000 eggs in that week. That's how many she's laid. This is a starting queen in a package that's under incredible stress. Now remember, this isn't a regular working colony. This is a colony that's trying to make wax, trying to find food, trying to raise young, trying to figure out what's going on. The old bees are dying every day. It's cold. The food is way up on top, and I can't get to it. All sorts of stresses are going on in this colony, so that she can even lay that many eggs is kind of amazing. As the week progresses and a little more wax and a little things calm down just a little bit, you can figure maybe 5,000 to 6,000 eggs the second week that she's going to lay. Now these are some good estimates, but they're estimates. Realize that, please. So after the 4th week, then the first, it takes 21 days. After the 4th week, then you've got some adults emerging, and then you're beginning to see the population of your colony do what? Well, you've got old bees that are still dying, and in fact, after 4 weeks, they're dying pretty fast. These were adult, up to a couple, 3 weeks old when you got them. They live maybe 6 weeks. So after they've been around 6 weeks in your colony, they're starting to drop off pretty fast. So they're being replaced at what kind of rate with your new bees? And that's one of the things that you've got to be watching for. How is the population of your colony going? Because again, your queen, if you recall, your queen is laying more eggs every few days. Her rate increases, yet you've still got the same number of bees to take care of her and take care of that brood, and you've got the same number of bees who are trying to bring in that much more pollen and nectar to feed an ever-increasing number of young in the colony. So the stress hasn't let up. And right today, at 6 weeks, that colony is essentially as stressed as it was 4 weeks ago, 5 weeks ago, in terms of trying to provision for all the young, and with a population that is, although getting younger now, still has a fair number of older bees. So at 6 weeks, where you are now, as Shane said earlier, we tend to, as beekeepers, we tend to look at the flowers are blooming, the weather's nice, things are going fine. I look in the colony, they're running around doing what they're supposed to be doing. But the tension is, if you could be at their level, the tension is still there. And it's going to stay there for another couple, 3 more weeks until the adult population begins to exceed the brood population. And then everybody kind of takes a collective sigh and is able to catch their breath a little bit. But when you're seeing what you're seeing on the screen right now, you're looking at new bee, barely new bees, because they've just started to emerge, and probably still some old bees who are being forced to learn how to relearn how to feed young. At the same time, they're out there they're feeding young in the morning and foraging in the afternoon and catching their breath at night. You got some busy bees in there, Shane.
Yes, there are. I think that this is a really important point. You made the comment that basically at 6 weeks the colony is as stressed as it was essentially on day 1, and I think you could almost emphasize that a little bit more and say that they're almost more stressed, because when you install them, yeah, they've got wax comb to build, but now essentially the bees that were there on day 1, you're asking them to, in a very polite way, of course, to build wax, to forage for the resources for that colony, and to tend to brood. And what happens, I think, is that the queen begins, they start to build comb, the queen begins to lay like mad using the, like you said, sort of those numbers. And when she begins to lay, the population can support those, but that population of a package, at least, now some of you started with nukes, but with a package, the population actually decreases before it increases. And so in that transition period, it's really sort of touch and go, I think. And it's a really stressful time on the colony, and frankly can be for the beekeeper as well. So you've really got to have a good sense of what's going on in that colony.
That was one of the reasons back at the beginning that I kind of alluded to keeping some feed available.
Yeah.
If you get 3 days of rain and nothing's coming in, you're looking at some stress bees, and suddenly there isn't any food available, or there's very little, and they've got to decide where's it going to go. You have 2 weeks ago, Shane, here in Ohio, we had a week where, in a 1 week period, we had 2 nights where it froze and 2 days where we had tornadoes.
Oh dear.
And for a colony, the tornadoes, of course, unless they run into one, isn't going to be a stress. But 2 nights of freezing, and you've got a limited number of bees to cover that comb, and you've got an expanding brood population. Chilled brood is not out of the question. And of course, there's not much a beekeeper can do about that, but that stress is always there, and it doesn't go away for quite a while in a brand new package.
I agree, but hopefully, ultimately, we end up with something that looks like this, where we've got a pretty good brood pattern, and all these bees. This is obviously an established colony that's doing quite well. Did you have anything in particular you wanted to mention about this?
Well, one of the things that I mentioned earlier was, is your queen really laying 2,000 eggs a day? And let me back up a half a second. Shane, you and I were talking earlier about at 6 weeks. At about 6 weeks, how much brood there should be in a colony? How much? And let's just talk about open and sealed brood. Let's ignore eggs for the moment. And I know this number is going to vary depending how far south and north you are, but what's your numbers on sealed and open brood in a colony 6 weeks old? What would you expect?
We're talking about packages now.
Right.
Because, of course, a nuke, presumably, if it's a 5-frame nuke, from day one, you're going to have about 3 frames in there. At least most people, that's the way most people sell their 5-frame nukes. But a package of bee, there's a lot of factors that are going to go into this. Weather, nectar availability, whether you're feeding or not, which you should be. But I would say at this point, about 6 weeks in, I would say about, I don't know, 5 to 10 frames. Of course, that's a huge spread, but as you mentioned, we're dealing with perhaps Florida on up to Maine, or maybe Arizona on up into Washington. So, there's a huge geographic spread there, but I would say about 5 to 10 frames of brood, and those frames may have about be half covered with brood.
So this frame is actually, that you're looking at, is actually more than half covered. This is probably 3/4 covered.
Yeah.
But I'll just give you some more numbers if you want to think for a minute. How many bees is that really? And you're looking at a deep frame there. And a deep frame has, on average, depending on the manufacturer, about 9,000 cells on a frame. That's both sides. So you're saying that a frame, it should be about half full. That's half on both sides. So you're looking at about 4,500 bees on a frame, or 4,500 cap cells on a frame, open and cap cells on a frame. And you should have between 5 and 10 of those. So let's say you've got 5. You're looking at, what is it, 5 times 4,000, that's 20,000 bees that are going to emerge in 3 weeks or less, right?
Was I a bit over-optimistic?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. Because you got to remember, you've also got bees that are leaving the scene every day too. The mortality rate and the birth rate need to be factored. Both of those need to be factored in. If you're doing like I do, I have all mediums, almost all, exclusively all mediums. You're looking at about 6,300 cells total on both sides of the frame, and the half of one of those again is going to be, what, about 3,100 or so. Now, if I'm running all mediums, Shane, versus all deeps, I should probably be seeing more frames half full.
Well, I was sort of thinking towards, I'm in the process of going to all medium, so I was sort of thinking along those lines. So my 5 to 10, I was thinking more along the lines of mediums than deeps.
I like that number. Yeah, I'm a little more comfortable with that. But maybe you're a better beekeeper than I am, so I would have given it to you there. But when you're taking your colony apart and you're looking to evaluate your queen, is what we're doing in this situation. We're looking at her performance, and you're looking for 5 to 10, let's say 5 to 10 medium frames of brood. And you look at this frame. This is about 3/4. If you can do a mental note in your head and actually do that count, and let's say you look at all of the brood frames and you come up with some number total of, let's say you've got 5, let's say you've got 10 half frames of brood. That's 5 full frames of brood. That's going to give you about 30,000 cells of bees. Write that number down. And now here's the trick. Come back in 12 days, exactly 12 days, and do it again. 12 days is the length of time that your workers are in sealed brood. So you've got 30,000 the first time, and you go through your colony again. And every time you're looking in your colony, I urge you to practice this, because it really gives you an idea of the potential population in your colony, what's coming down the road. Suddenly you've got 30,000 bees the first time, and if you come back again and count, and suddenly you've got 50,000 capped cells, just capped, not open, just capped. The difference between those two, divided by 12, is your eggs per day. So you've got 20,000 difference divided by 12. It's going to come up to, what is it, 1,500 eggs a day? Suddenly that's about what people are telling you, isn't it? So if you practice this, not every time, but often enough that you begin to get comfortable with estimating the future population of your colony. Now, if you take a look at the frame that's sitting there right now, and you look at it closely, a bee covers 2 cells when she's standing on the frame. So if you're looking at a frame that's half covered with bees, you can guesstimate the population that's in that colony of bees right now, just knowing that the number of cells on a deep or a medium frame. Well, now I'm looking at how many bees are going to be on that frame as soon as all of this brood emerges. I better get some boxes on this colony, because I'm not going to have room for bees, and that takes me where, Shane?
Well, it certainly is concerning, given that I believe this to be the top box, and it gets us into a little bit ahead when we start talking about supering later on. But that's I've never heard it talked about in that way, sort of really truly trying to assess the number of eggs that are being laid, right? We always say a queen can do so many eggs a day, and we just assume our queens are, but the fact of the matter is these queens are really just like people. You're going to have some that are more productive than others for a lot of different reasons. And doing an assessment like this can really give us some insight in just how productive our colony may or may not be. So you've inspired me, Kim. I'm going to try this little trick, and I'll let you know what I find out.
Well, if you write it down, and I'm not going to say I'm the world's worst record keeper, but I'm approaching there. But this is one of the things that I do try to do with some regularity. When I've got every colony numbered, and if you got 2 colonies, it's the one on the left or the right. But when you get to be 5 or 6, and then you do a split and you bring in a nuke and things get complicated, a numbering system that I found always works is you just number every colony. That way, number 32 stays at home, and if it goes to a bee yard, doesn't become number 1 in that bee yard. It's still colony 32. Anyway, when I'm going through number 32, and I don't do this every time, but I will make it a point to do it 3 or 4 times in a season, I will try and measure sealed brood. And it gives me, as you said, it gives me an idea, A, how productive my queen is, and B, how many bees are going to be in that colony in a very short period of time. And then I've got my notes, and I'm going to say, yeah, bring supers, or maybe bring feed, because things are slowing down and they shouldn't be, or something's going on that I need to pay attention to. It's one more thing to look at.
And are you finding that the 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day is a pretty good rule of thumb?
I got to be honest, if I got one that's doing 1,500 a day, I'm pretty pleased, because most of them aren't up that. 1,200 is a good queen. The queens that I've got in the spot that I'm at, the way I keep bees, how's that for an out? But 2,000 a day, I would be really happy if I could find a queen that was consistently doing 2,000 a day. That's a big colony if you look at it by the end of the peak of the season.
So I'm going to put this slide up here as I ask this next question for a segue into our next topic, which is, so you're saying if you're getting 1,200 eggs a day, that's you're happy with that, but yet everything that we've heard says 1,500 to 2,000 eggs a day. So is it that the literature and the information out there is overstating what a queen really can do, or is it that we now have underperforming queens from perhaps when some of those original assessments were done?
That's a good question. I don't have the answer to that. I know I've looked at the data, and in fact, when I was at Madison, at the bee lab there, we did basically these same measurements, and we had 1,800 to 2,200 egg a day queens then. We didn't have Varoa then, and therein lies perhaps a difference. Is just the influence that Varoa has had on all of beekeeping, whether it's the queen production unit that made the queen that sent her to me, and she came just a tiny bit damaged because of the things that were going on down there, or they're damaged here. There's contaminants in the wax. I don't know, Shane. But like I said, If I got one that was 1,500 a day consistently, I'd be real happy.
Okay.
And I know that the 2,000 a day used to exist.
Okay, so something has changed. It might not necessarily be the quality of queen, but obviously something has changed that our queens aren't quite able to do what they were able to do pre-Varoa. What it is, we're not quite sure at this point.
A quick aside, and then we'll get back to what you want to do here. I'm not sure it's queens. I mean, I suspect that it is, but if there's something going on with the quality of the workers who aren't able to care for, maybe they're not producing as much food. Maybe they're not moving as fast. Maybe there's a union. I don't know. That has changed their behavior. I don't have that answer, but I'm open to any suggestions because, like I said, I've seen a difference. I'm sorry for the aside. Go ahead.
Good comic relief. So in this picture, I'm not sure if you had anything in particular to say about this, but I just love seeing pictures like this. I mean, this is, we've got something like this in some of our information that we give out to folks as sort of like an anatomy of a frame. Of course, we're in really close here, but you've got up in let me get my highlighter, up in this corner up in here, you've got open cells of nectar. You've got this sort of rainbow effect as we move from the center of the frame on out, where you've got your capped brood here, you've got some pollen up in here, and it's extending a little bit into here, and you've got some, if you look real close, an egg and another egg, and then real tiny larva, and then and the larva as gets bigger. That this is sort of really, in my mind anyway, really what you want to see in a good, healthy colony, sort of this capped brood radiating out into some more mature larvae and then ultimately into smaller larvae and then eggs, and with some pollen and some honey or nectar tucked up into the corners of those frames. Of course, keeping it in mind that as this frame matures, that some of the cells back in this area down here in the lower right corner and more in the center of the frame, as those cells mature, the bees are going to emerge, and so we're going to open up that portion of the frame. And so it's not going to, of course, stay like this. This is sort of a wave in motion. But this, to me, really sort of suggests a good healthy colony that's doing well with a good queen. Did you want to add anything to that, Kim?
Boy, you covered it all. I also like looking at that transition from egg to young larva. It just when you're looking at the whole frame, it gives you the picture of how the colony cohesiveness is working.
Mm-hmm. As opposed to something like this, we talked just a little bit ago about, are our queens really performing? And when you and I talked earlier this week, we sort of came to the conclusion that this frame almost embodies just about everything that could go wrong with a queen in your colony. And so what do we have going on in this picture here, or series of pictures?
Well, when you look at the big picture in the background, immediately it doesn't look like that nice frame of full frame of brood you had there a couple of pictures ago. The pattern is spotty. It's mixed up. It's almost appears to be random where the queen has been laying. Without looking closer, that's the first thing that I would suspect. Down in the bottom, you get your magic marker out there, Shane, and I think you can see where some
down here.
Well, there too, but yeah, right there.
Oh, okay.
You've got some
couple things circled there.
Drone eggs that have been laid in there, so you've got something else going on. Either a queen has become a drone layer, or you've got laying workers, or you've got a drone laying, all sorts of things that aren't supposed to be happening are happening in that part of the frame. So immediately when you pull this frame out, your first thought is something's radically wrong here, and now I got to figure out what it is. And then I got to, now that I know that there's something wrong, once you figure out what it is, what can I do to fix it so that my colony doesn't, go back 2 months and have to start over again essentially. So given that you know something's wrong, the other things that you start looking for, when you see a spotty brood pattern, when you see drone cells up, you probably can figure that the queen is not doing what she's supposed to be doing, or she may even be gone. She may have been damaged when you got her, and she could only last, a few weeks. She may have been poorly mated, and she ran out of sperm. She may have been damaged when you were replacing a frame. She may have had nosema. When she arrived at your place, and a queen with nosema is a death sentence. She'll be dead in between 3 and 4 weeks. The disease turns her ovaries to mush, and she's pretty much a goner. So any of those things could have happened. You don't know what's going on when you first look at this. If you start looking at other frames, you may see something like this in the upper right-hand corner, and at first glance you would probably suspect that these are supersedure cells because they are not in the bottom of the frame. They're on the face of the frame. And what has happened is that the queen has quit functioning. She may still be there. She may not be there. She may be dead and gone. But she has quit functioning in that her pheromones no longer are holding back the urge for the workers in the colony to produce queen cells. She is not being the chemical leader, if you will, and they are now free to replace her, or they've been released to replace her. And what they do is they find the youngest larva that they can, perhaps an egg, if they can find one, and they begin to produce queen cells like you're seeing in that picture there. The queen, because she's larger, is going to require a larger cell, so they extend the cell and actually ends up hanging downwards. You'll see one of those later that Shane has a picture of. But you may see on another frame, not the one you're looking at, but you may see supersedure cells similar to this one. If you look carefully and you turn the frame and look down inside the cell, you may see a larva swimming in a sea of royal jelly. Then you know something's really going on. Occasionally, colonies will start supersedure cells and nothing happens. And especially if you've got some Russian blood in your bees, this isn't an uncommon experience. However, you probably won't see the frame with all of the drones and the spotty brood in that, but you may see several supersedure cells at any given time. So once you can appreciate the fact that there's something wrong with your queen, and then you're going to have to make a decision on what am I going to do about that queen being gone. Am I going to replace her? Am I going to let the bees raise the queen themselves? Am I going to get a queen cell? You have to provide the bees some direction, or you have to do nothing and let the bees decide themselves. And there are ramifications from each of those decisions. If you search your colony and indeed you find no queen, which I would suspect you would in this case. Actually, I know that you would because that's a picture that I took of a queen in a queenless colony. Once you decide that you have no queen, and I said you have to make some decisions. You can call up your package producer and say, it's only been 6 weeks, my queen is gone, what went wrong? And the package producer or the nuke producer may have some questions for you. And the questions may draw out some facts that there may have been a problem with the queen when it was sent to you, in which case it may be replaced. But after 6 weeks, I suspect not. The time lag has been pretty long, and the difference, the fault, if you will, is going to point more to you than the original producer. I'm not necessarily sure I agree with that, but that's usually the case, often the case. So you can just say, okay, I'm going to have to bite the bullet, and I got to get a new queen, and you order a queen from one of the suppliers you find in the magazines, or somebody that you know locally that raises queens, a good first choice, by the way. And you reinstall her using, why not, a BrushyMtn queen installation frame, or any of the other techniques that you've learned or seen used, and you get this colony back and going. You want to get that queen in there as fast as you can, as soon as you can. If you are of the mindset that I don't want this colony to miss a beat, I want them growing just as fast as they can, as much as they can this season, so that they winter well. You may decide to buy a queen cell if some of those are locally available, and then of course you have to look at the downtime of that queen cell to or that queen to emerge, mate, and then start up. Not a lot different than your packaged queen did. Or if you got a nuke, this will be the first time you've done this. So you've got some downtime in there until she gets ready and until she starts laying at a good rate. But it's still not as long time if you let the colony raise their own queen. There's a whole lot of things about letting a colony raise its own queen that you need to be aware of if you choose to go that route. One of them is, of course, if you let the colony raise its own queen, she's going to fly out and mate with who? And therein lies a choice. The offspring will be, at least half local. You will, and if that's your goal, is to raise survivor queens and survivor colonies, then what you're going to want to do is start doing this. It may be a little late in the season to do this for your colony's sake, in that she's all they've got. And if something goes wrong, birds like queens really well. Suddenly your colony is hopelessly queenless, and then you've got a whole other set of problems. She may mate with, Joe Beekeeper's drones down the way, and you know what kind of a beekeeper that guy is. You don't want anything to do with his drones. Or they may meet with Sally Beekeeper up the road, and she's, top shelf beekeeper. So you may hope that they meet up, and your queen mates well and enough. And this early in the season, or this late in the season, they're probably the likelihood of them mating well is probably going to be good. But then you've got all that downtime of when she comes back, and again, it takes, you have to raise her, and then you have to mate her, and then you have to wait for her to get back up to speed. And you're looking at, it could be, 6 weeks before she's really up to speed. 6 weeks from now is what, the middle of July. And you've got an overwintering situation staring you in the face that you've got to prepare for. So when you find this frame, you have a lot of decisions to make. It could be easy. You can let them do it and say, I'm going to let them do what they want. You can go get a queen in a hurry, or you can get a queen cell. All of those things, as I said, have ramifications. All of them are workable, but all of them, the outcome of all of them, the outcome of none of them is perfect. The least likely chance of a problem is when you buy a mated queen. The most dangerous, if you will, is letting them raise themselves. Down in the bottom right-hand corner, you've got a frame that's solid drone brood. And this frame is here for, just as a reminder, that one of the things that can happen to a queen, especially if she's poorly mated, is that she can become a drone layer. She runs out of sperm, and all she can lay is unfertilized eggs. One of the things to keep in mind when you are ordering queens, this year, this is your first year, you didn't have a whole lot of options. You got the packages when the guy said he was going to bring them up from the south, or bring them from California. Whenever they were coming in, you took them when you could get them. But the next time you do this, one of the things to look to keep in mind, especially if you're buying a queen next spring to requeen additional colonies or requeen your nuke, is what's the weather like where your queen's coming from? And the Weather Channel and the computers have made that relatively easy to see. If you know exactly where your queen's coming from, and what county in Georgia or what county in California, and you watch the weather and you know, okay, she's going to arrive on about this date, that means that she's going to be in her mating nuke about this long, and she's going to be mating here about 4 weeks before I get her. Well, 4 to 5 weeks before you're supposed to get your queen, if you're watching the weather and you see 21 days of rain, which they kind of had in Georgia this year, almost, you can be kind of sure that her flying days were limited. Her flying days are limited. The ability for her to mate are going to be restricted, and the likelihood of getting a queen of less than fully mated proportions increases, certainly. I think, Shane, you and I were talking the other day, and all of the things that you can do to measure the quality of the queen, it always comes down to size, or almost always comes down to size.
Well, that according to, well, I don't want to put Dave Tarpey on the spot quite as much as I was about to, but he did a webinar with me last fall and looking at the quality of commercially available queens, and size was an indicator of in terms of how well that queen mated, how well or how much pheromone that queen produced, and of course, you know, you use the phrase chemical leader in a hive, which I think is really what the queen does. I mean, she provides that pheromone, and so size was a very good indicator of that. I want to just go back to a couple of points without derailing your train of thought too much, but it's worth mentioning these cell cups up here. You mentioned that, you know, it's very likely that they'll be in the colony. But it's really only an issue if they start utilizing these cell cups. And also, again, going back to the population dynamics of a package, the colony can almost be sort of tricked, if we can use that phrase, into thinking that they're failing because of the aging population of bees. And so it's not uncommon, in my experience anyway, to see some of these cups appear especially in a package, because the aging population of the bees before the new brood starts to emerge. And then a couple more things that you know, you were talking about letting them sort of run their course. You know, we've got some supersedure cells down in here, letting them run their course and have those cells emerge. And when you and I were talking, I was kept falling into the mind trap that this was sort of an established colony, and to some extent it is, but we're working with the title here of 6 weeks as a beekeeper. So if this colony is only 6 weeks old, the population never really grew to be anything of great significance. And I would say that if you let them run their course, this colony is really, really going to be struggling. And not only that, but I'll default back to a talk that I heard Dave Tarpey do up in Connecticut, looking at supersedure queens. You know, supersedure queens and emergency queen cells sometimes don't produce necessarily the best quality queens because they utilize larvae that's available to them. And sometimes that larva may be one that's a bit older, therefore that queen is going to emerge first and bump off all the other queens in that colony. And if that happens, generally speaking, a queen that was reared from a 3-day-old larva isn't as good as a queen that was reared from a 1-day-old larva, but yet the one from a 3-day-old larva is going to be the first one emerging because it's 2 days older. So by letting this sort of run its course, you may actually be selecting for a colony that might not necessarily have the best queen in it. So I just wanted to sort of emphasize those, and now I've probably completely derailed your train of thought, Kim, and I apologize, but those were some notes that I sort of jotted down here as you were going along.
No, good points. I think with a package situation this late in the season, letting a colony requeen itself is asking for a lot of trouble. It's a good point. The only thing I was talking about is looking for a frame of, you know, lots of drone brood and what probably happened and ways to perhaps avoid that in the future. So as I think you said earlier, we probably have beaten this one to death. So the other side of this coin, of course, is when a colony is really doing well. And then you run into what you're going to look at next,
which is a swarming situation here. Now, the difference between the queen cell that we're seeing here is that it's hanging from the bottom of the frame, which is more typical of a swarm cell than a supersedure and emergency queen cell. And so here we've got a population that's really just busting out. Typically, resources are abundant, and it's worth sort of mentioning that swarming is really the colony's only means to propagate and ensure the future generation, so to speak, of bees. That yes, individual bees are reproducing inside the colony, but an individual bee can't go off and start a new colony. It can't survive on its own. Even a queen by herself cannot go off and start a new colony. That swarming is an instinctual thing. They're genetically programmed to do this to ensure the future generations of honeybees. And so sometimes it can be really difficult to prevent, and I tend to say that you can't prevent swarming. The best you can do is mitigate some of the conditions that ultimately lead to swarming in hopes that you're successful. And some of those might be, if you're overwintering, rotating brood chambers, ensuring that they've got space in that colony, giving them new frames of foundation to give them space. But if you're talking about a new colony, it's really in terms of staying ahead of the bees. And we'll talk about this in just a little bit when we talk about supering and adding stories. But you've got to think about that frame of brood that we showed you earlier when Kim was talking about sort of the future population of the colony. You've got to sort of anticipate what that colony is going to do, not tomorrow, but in a week or two from now, to ensure that they've got space to expand into so you don't see something like this. But Kim, I did want to ask you one question about swarming and about requeening. How often do you think people ought to requeen their colonies?
I'm an advocate of every year, and I still have trouble with that. I'm an advocate because the queens that I get now aren't the queens that I got 20 years ago, and all sorts of the reasons we were talking about earlier. So I don't see queens lasting 2 years anymore. I see them lasting, if I'm lucky, overwintering. And when I say lasting, I mean lasting productively. You know, being a good producer, eggs and you know, staying ahead with the population. They slow down. They seem to me to be slowing down faster. The commercial beekeepers will tell you a queen lasts about 3/4 of the season, and that's not as long as it used to be in that setting, which is certainly more stressful than my backyard. But so as a result, I'm saying if you're into honey production and you want a strong productive colony, I advocate every other year. By the same token, getting rid of a queen after only a year is really hard for me to do, and I'm running out of observation hives to give them to. So you know, you got a $20 bug in your hand, and she's not doing what you need her to do in your colony. But at the same token, she's still, you know, she's like an old dog. You know, she doesn't hunt anymore, but gee, she's still a good pet. You know, so I'm always sort of lost when I have to do that. I try to find some place to find a good home for her to last, you know, so she can finish off her days in peace.
I used to think that the requeening every year was propaganda by the queen breeders just to get people to buy more queens. Until I read a research paper that came out of Europe, I think, that said a queen that's more than a year old is more than 3 times more likely to swarm than a queen that's less than a year old. Just because of the nature of a lot of things that you were just mentioning. So that sort of made me rethink things because, of course, while I just said that swarming's a natural thing and it's really difficult to absolutely prevent it, it's certainly not necessarily a great thing if you're trying to keep a good, strong, healthy colony to get some honey off of, because, of course, it cuts your population in half and your bee population in half. But Kim, I'm going to advance here a little bit, and because we're running behind schedule, and you know, I want to be mindful of your time and the folks listening in. We wanted to talk a little bit about Varoa, but really Varoa and pest management can be a topic that we could go on for hours on. But I think the point that we wanted to make here is that a lot of times people get new colonies and they think that you know, their bees have been treated. They may even think that they're Varoa free, and I would argue that anyone that guarantees a Varoa free package is probably more than likely lying to you, because that's really difficult to ensure. So your packages, your nukes will have some Varoa in them, and this is, you know, just sort of to give people a sense of what to look for. We've got a screen bottom board with a tray underneath. Here's sort of that tray up closer and all the debris, and of course all these little red things here are Varoa. And here's a close-up of it, so you can see what they look like a little bit more, because sometimes people that aren't used to looking for these little buggers have a difficult time finding them. If you see something like this on this screen right here on this monitoring board, that can be fairly disturbing. But I think what I wanted to emphasize here is that doing a single snapshot, a single sample, once in August to get a sense of what your Varoa population is doing really isn't adequate nowadays. So what you've got to do is look over time. You've got a sample in June, you've got a sample in July, August, and even into September. And especially if you're putting on some sort of treatment, you've got to test during that treatment to ensure that it's actually working, because there's some mite-resistant or some mites that are resistant to some of those hard chemicals that people are using nowadays. And so if you're using one of those products, it might not actually work. So you got to test, you got to monitor while you're applying that product. Because here's the thing, someone came into my office the other day and said, well, I got a new package. I didn't think I need to do anything until August. And I threw out the following scenario, that if you take a sample, let's say you take a sample in July and you've got 20 Varoa in a 24-hour mite drop. That's not a great number, but it's not terrible in July. But now, and so that's all you've got to go on. But now let's say you've got two colonies, both produce that same number, 20 mites in a 24-hour period. Let's say you did a sample in June, and one colony had 5 in June, and another had 15. So now you've got one colony that went from 5 to 20, and another one that went from 15 to 20. And now you add in a sample in August, and now the one that went from 5 to 20 is now at 40. And the one that went from 15 to 20 may only be at, say, 30. Well, if we only had that one sample in July, we'd think both colonies are the same. But now with that trend information, which hive is more troubling? The one that's gone from 15 to 20 to 30, or from 5 to 20 to 40? I would say that exponential growth is a little bit more concerning than the one that's growing a little bit more slowly. And so trend information, and Kim, I blame you for this, because you're the one that really hammered this home to me last year at some point when we were talking, that you've got to know what's happening over time. And this monitoring tray is the way to do it. If you go to your hive, all you got to do is slip this board in. If you do a hive manipulation, slip it in, wait 3 days, then pull it out, count up all the mites on it, and divide by 3. That'll give you a 24-hour mite drop. If you don't do a hive manipulation, just slide it in, wait 24 hours, pull it out, count up all the mites, and that's what your 24-hour mite drop. And record that information. Record it with that brood data that Kim was talking about earlier to get a sense of what's happening in your colony over time. You have anything you wanted to add there, Kim?
Boy, I think you hit it all, Shane. It's with packages and small colonies, it bears watching, probably not bears worrying about yet.
Well, good. We did want to talk about this because I think both you and I are really strong advocates of drone trapping. This is a picture of a medium frame without any foundation in it. Is this one that from your colony, Kim, that you just plunked in there and let them draw out the comb and they drew out all this drone and filled it on up?
I believe it was, or certainly the pictures in my collection anyway. But I've looked at a lot of those over the last few years. Just looks just like that. If you're there's using chemicals in your hive is troubling for me. In fact, I don't do it, and I sometimes pay the price. But for Varoa, this is one of the ways that that certainly works for me pretty well, is drone trapping. And down at the bottom, you can see where you put in either a drone comb, if you get your drone foundation, or I put in empty frames just because I don't like putting foundation in frames. And the bees do this very nicely. Your colony is going to have a certain percent of the bees that they raise are going to, about 15% of the bees that they raise are going to be drones into the peak of the year. they're going to raise them anyway. They're going to put them somewhere on top of frames and in misshapen parts of your foundation, wherever. All I'm doing is giving them a place to put it. Once I put it in, then you can see where either I use 8 frames, I put them on 1 and 8. That's on the edge of the brood nest. And every 21 days I come in, I repeat them, and I usually only have to do it 3 times. I've got them in now. They just went in over Memorial Day weekend. 3 weeks I'll pull them out. 3 weeks after that I'll pull them out. And then, by then I may not have to do any more. But if I have to, then I'll put in for 3 more weeks. I go on the 3-week rotation because it's easy for me to remember. Drones take a little bit longer than that, and if I wanted to wait to 100% the length of time, it'd be 24, 25, 26 days. But 21 days works for me, and you know, you can come up with your own schedule. You don't want to go 30 days and let them all emerge, of course.
Yeah.
By the time I've done 3, I don't have enough mites to worry about.
And it's worth bearing that this is something that you absolutely have to be diligent about. If you're a procrastinator, if you can't get back there within 24 days, you know, Kim and I talked about this, and we talked about 21 to 24 days, and he said, look, 21 days, that way if it's rainy that day, I can go on the 22nd day, and there's no harm, no foul. But if you're someone that, well, I'll get to it tomorrow, or I'll get to it this weekend, you probably don't want to be using this method of mite control, because you will absolutely skyrocket your mite levels, because the mites gravitate toward these drone cells. That's why this works. And once these drone cells are sealed, the mites are essentially imprisoned inside that sealed cell. You take the frame out. If you want, you can cut out what you see here and let the bees start over. If you want to try and preserve some of the investment that they've made into drawing that wax, you can freeze this. You got to be a little gentle, because this is all wax and it's brittle and can crack, but you can freeze it and reuse this. The bees will uncap and clean out those cells, and the queen will come back through and utilize it again. And like Kim said, here's sort of some position information. If you're running a 10 frame, either in the 2 or 9 position, 8 frame, 1 or 8 position, for the queen to utilize that frame for drone. Now the last thing we want to get to, and we're already over time, so I apologize to folks, is talking about supering or adding on the next story to your colony, the next layer. And I'm hoping that these images are clear enough for you to see, but basically what we've got here, on the left side, you can see that this is the outside frame. We don't have any bees there. They're all here in the center, whereas look at all the bees on the outside frame here. If your colonies, if this is your top story in your colony, you're behind the 8 ball already. So you need to add another story here, because their bees are getting crowded, and you may end up seeing them hanging in a tree like we saw earlier. Even this colony with no bees here, but all these bees here, you're running probably a little bit behind. But you can see the difference here in congestion in terms of where the bees are and how many frames they've got under development. And this next picture, you can see here's a frame that's being pulled up from the outside of an 8-frame box. Not a whole lot of bees on it, but you can tell that this frame really is well developed. Even all the way out here to the edges, they've got comb being drawn. And my rule of thumb is that if you've got about 2/3 to 3/4 of your frames in the top story under development, in other words, there may be brood in some, there may be honey in some, they may be drawing wax in this case where there's just wax being drawn, it's time to think about it's time to add another story. And you follow that. I follow that same rule of thumb whether it's a brood chamber or a honey super. But you don't simply want to stack on a bunch of empty boxes and think they're good to go, I don't have to come back to them for a while, because what will happen is that queen and that colony will stay clustered in the center of the hive and just create this chimney right up through the center, not getting out to these outside frames and not utilizing the corners of the hives. And they need to utilize and develop that portion of the hive so they've got honey reserves, they've got pollen reserves, and they've got all that space for overwintering. Because if you don't force them into developing that portion of the hive, you're going to have a real problem come overwintering. So you want to add the stories one at a time, and you want to add them when you've got about 2/3 to 3/4 of the frames under development. The other point that I'll make here is that 50% of the beekeepers love queen excluders, 50% of the beekeepers hate them. I'm in the camp of someone that likes them. But if you're starting with all brand new equipment and you're ready to add your first honey super, I would not put your queen excluder on right away, because that undrawn foundation above that queen excluder isn't very enticing to the bees. So they may be reluctant to pass through it to get to undrawn foundation. Once the comb's drawn out, they don't have a problem. So if you put a brand new equipment on, I'd leave the queen excluder out, let them go up in there. You can maybe take a frame of brood and pop it up in there. If you did that, you could put that queen excluder in. But you need to entice them to go up in there. Once they start drawing wax, storing nectar, maybe laying some eggs, they'll readily pass through a queen excluder, and you can slip it in a little bit later. Any brood that may be up there, it'll emerge out in 21 days, and you won't even know that it was there. But just make sure your queen is below that queen excluder when you do actually slip it in there. Anything you want to add there, Kim?
Well, only, Shane, that I tend to be a little less time conscious than you are, and just because I don't get to the bee yard as often as I should, when I see that, as almost always, I'm behind adding a super, okay, I'm going to be ahead on the next one, so instead of putting one on, I'll put on two, and so I'm behind on one and early on the other one, and it almost always works okay, but it isn't as good as what you just explained in terms of working with the bees. I'm trying to push them into my schedule rather than the other way around.
But correct me if I'm wrong, your comb is drawn. In other words, they've already drawn comb on that foundation, or is it undrawn?
It's either.
Either.
You know, sometimes, yeah. Sometimes, I think one of the things that everybody's going to find is almost never do you have all of the equipment that you want in the condition that you want it. You will, in your beekeeping career, put on unpainted boxes, unwired foundation, and all sorts of things, because I got to do it right now, and I'm not going to have time to make it as pretty as I'd like, or as good as I'd like, or as finished as I'd like. But to get it to make it work, it's going to go on. That's never happened to you, has it, Shane?
Never, never. I better get to work before you come down here for EAS, because I got some repair to do on my colonies, some painting. But hopefully, if everything goes right, if you don't see any of those supersedure cells, no swarms hanging in the trees, and you've added the stories as you need, you begin to see frames like this where they're just bringing in some beautiful light-colored honey, wall-to-wall frames, and you end up with some nice capped honey at the end of the season that you can harvest. I'm not going to say much more about that unless you want to, Kim, because we've already gone 20 minutes beyond 7, and I'm sure there's a slew of questions that people want to have answered.
No, you said it all, Shane. I appreciate the patience of people who've listened in.
All right. Well, let me open up my questions panel here, because, like I said, I'm sure there's just a slew of questions, and sure enough, there are. Forgive me as I sort of scan through these. It's difficult to monitor while you're talking and trying to pay attention to the good information. Is feeding syrup and providing water the same thing?
Well, it can be in that you're providing, syrup has got water in it, and if that's what you're trying to do. But if you're trying to get carbohydrates into your colony, certainly water is not going to provide that. You do need to provide water. If you don't have a natural source nearby, you need to provide some in your yard, absolutely, positively, without question. Something to consider is a Boardman feeder in a situation like that. If you need to provide water and you need to know when they're running out, just a pail of water with some floats, just don't ever let it go dry. But no, water and sugar, you're getting moisture into the colony, but you're not getting any carbohydrates, it's just water.
So how, we talked about earlier on when to feed or not to feed, and I made the statement that once your supers are on there, you want to take off that feeder. You made the suggestion or recommendation that you don't necessarily have to remove it, but maybe thin it out so you don't end up with sugar water being stored in your honey supers. But the point that we wanted to make was you've got to know what's going on in nature so that if that nectar flow stops, you can respond and make sure the needs of your colony are met. And so this question is, how do you know when there's a nectar flow or when it's stopped or slowing, and if the colony is got the resources that it needs?
Oh, you're asking me.
Yes. Yes. What's happening here, Kim, is while you're responding, I continue to scan through the questions.
The last frame that you showed, the last picture that you showed was one of the reasons. It was one of the ways to know that there's a nectar flow going on. If you're actually accumulating nectar in drawn-out cells in your honey supers. Before you get to that point, however, one of the things that happens in a colony is you will see what, there's a lot of terms for it, but bees are whitening the wax. And that's if you've already got a drawn comb and it's just been sitting in there. When a honey flow starts, or when you start feeding a sugar syrup, they're going to start adding wax to the edges of things and smoothing the edges and neatening up the comb and to get ready to receive more nectar. Bees don't produce wax unless nectar is coming in. If you're not feeding and you see wax being built, that's a first sure sign. There's no nectar, no wax. If you've got wax being built and you're not feeding, you can be pretty sure that there's something going on. And you don't have to look very deep. All you have to do is pop the top and look at the top bars on your top super. If you're out there on the weekend and you're looking and the top bars are still white and there may be a little burr comb on them because they're still new. You come back in 4 or 5 days, maybe the next weekend, and you pop the top and you look, and sure enough, there's a whole bunch of, just barely discernible cells on the top bars. Just barely discernible, but you can see the pattern. You know something's going on because they don't build wax unless they've got carbohydrates coming in. You see that wax, you're almost too late. You better be moving.
I want to just take just a second here to make a statement, and I'll explain why I'm doing this in a second. I've been doing these webinars now for over a year, and frankly, it's a little different sitting in front of your computer screen, just talking to your computer screen. But one of the things that I really enjoy are the question and answer portions, and I think a lot of people get a lot of good information from this portion of the webinars. And there's a group of people that have been logged into the better portion of these and have asked really insightful questions. And there's a person that's made a statement, not a question. I'm going to convert it into a question here for you in a second, Kim. But I just want to acknowledge the folks that tune into these and really make it interesting for me at least, because this is really sort of the meat of it and really makes it fun for me. And I'd love to meet some of these people someday. But this person has a situation where they've had some bees in a public community garden, and they've asked him to remove, as I understand it, remove these colonies because they believe that only top bar hives can be maintained in a green-friendly manner, and they won't allow him to use any medication, fumagillin B, to control nosema. And you said that, I'm putting you on the spot here, and we're getting to the question portion, where you don't like to use chemicals in your colony. So one, I'm wondering what you think about fumagillin B, which is really just for treatment of nosema, especially in light of the new research that was presented out in, was it San Diego, that really showed a link between Nosema cerana and some viruses and that connection to CCD. So what's your take on Fumagillin B? Should or shouldn't people be really concerned about using it, and what other ways might you mitigate nosema if you don't use Fumagillin?
I don't use Fumagillin, and I probably won't use Fumagillin, and I probably will pay a price for it at some point. My bees will pay a price for it at some point. However, at the moment, Nosema cerana by itself seems not to be the worst thing that can happen to your colony. And the other piece of data that came out of that report, if the listeners aren't familiar with it, USDA released a study that showed that Fumagillin B, when mixed with several viruses, neither of which by themselves are terribly lethal, but when combined become very lethal. The Fumagillin enters the bee's gut, causes damage, and allows viral entry into the system of the bee, and then...
I'm sorry, the Fumagillin enters their gut, or the nosema? I'm
sorry, the nosema, thank you.
Yep.
The nosema enters the gut, causes damage, and the virus enters the bee through that portal. Without the virus, the nosema isn't particularly lethal. Without nosema, the virus can't get in, and your bee manages to remain relatively healthy. The key to all of that, if you're able to listen to the interview that Jay Evans did at the end of that, the key to all of this, he said, is to control nosema, and he suggested Fumagillin, but he said above all nutrition. A healthy, well-fed bee with a balanced diet and plenty of diversity in their diet is going to do better with any and all of those problems combined. So I fall back on a healthy bee is one that's well taken care of. And so when you say, am I using Fumagillin? No, I'm not. What am I doing to combat nosema? I'm making sure my bees are well fed. That's the best that I can do without adding an antibiotic, and that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. How's that?
That's a good story. I'm going to just ask a follow-up. What do you think about some of the supplements, like Honeybee Healthy, the Vita products, and there's a whole host of others?
I haven't done side-by-sides of those, so let me start there. I can't say one's better than the other. They all tend to be a feeding stimulant, and they all tend to cause bees to eat more of whatever it is that they have available to eat, and if it happens to be one of the supplements, they all tend to help. So if nutrition is my concern, and it certainly is all of the time, and I can't get bees to eat, or I want them to eat more, or I want to make sure that they're eating, I am going to use one of the stimulants, and I am going to use one of the supplements. Now, I don't have a lot of occasion to have to go that route, but I am, if you want to call those feeding stimulants a chemical, then yes, I am applying some chemicals to my bees. I will freely admit that. But boy, I tell you, you see what healthy, well-fed bees are compared to bees that are just getting by, and the difference is just phenomenal. So I'm happy with being able to use any of those in any combination.
We're advancing now a few years. You know, this one's titled 6 Weeks as a Beekeeper, but this question is regarding comb rotation. Both for the honey supers as well as the brood chambers. How often should beekeepers rotate their comb?
Well, of late the rule of thumb has come to be every 3 years, and I think that's probably a healthy formula to adapt. You more often than that, and it begins to get really expensive, but it also depends on what you're putting in your colonies. If you're putting in Coumaphos or fluvalinate or any of the other witch's brews that are out there, certainly you're going to have wax that's much different than someone who doesn't put anything in their colonies. Although even if you don't put anything in your colonies, your bees are bringing back some things. So I think that 3-year rotation probably is a good rule of thumb if you are doing any kind of treating. And you may be able to stretch that a little bit if you're doing no treating, but the other half of that is that after about 3 or 4 years, the cocoons and buildup inside the cells begins to be detrimental to the size of the bees, or it begins to change the size of the bees. I'm not sure it's a detriment. So 3 to 4 years, 3 to 5 years, if you're not treating, I think is probably good advice.
Okay. This is an interesting question, and one which I've actually had a couple of times this year. The people are actually seeing their queens kicked out of the colony. I had a phone call from someone a few weeks ago that saw their queen walking around the outside of the colony. They threw her back in. Shortly thereafter, she was out on the outside of the box, threw her back in, and ultimately, a week or so later, couldn't find her. Someone said they saw their queen on the ground in front of their colony. What's causing that, and what's the solution?
I have no idea.
Come on, Kim, you're all knowing.
I've never heard of that. I have heard of queens summarily dispatched, you know, torn to pieces. I've seen queens torn to pieces, wings and legs and pieces of body strewn about the bottom board when a colony didn't like a queen. But to be dismissed is, I'm speechless. I do not know.
Well, you ever listen to Click and Clack, the Tappet Brothers on Card Talk?
Oh, yeah.
Stump the chumps. We've just stumped the chumps. Here's another question. I just started.
What's your answer?
I can't remember what I told. I think I said, you know, we tried to put her back in there. I think what I suggested, and I actually haven't heard back, was that I was working with the assumption that she was a poorly mated. We had a sort of a perfect storm of situations. We had a poorly mated queen, the one that was walking around the colony, so they didn't really accept her very well, and that she had one of the rare situations where either a virgin or even a mated queen from the colony that those bees were shaken from was shaken into the package. So they actually had a good young, probably a virgin in that case, queen that was shaken into that package with her, and they were taking her as their own, and the other one was sort of being pushed out.
Okay.
Reasonable?
Sure.
Well, given you didn't come up with anything, we're going with that one. All right, here's the next question. I've just started, and I put my bees into. They started 2 colonies, and 3/4 of the bees of one colony went into the other colony. So now they've got 1 huge hive and 1 small hive. What are they to do with this situation?
Yeah, that's not uncommon when you get a lot of packages that come from the same supplier. They spend time sitting in a warehouse for a day or 2 or 3 waiting to be picked up. They get put on a truck. They get trucked up to wherever, New England or Ohio. They sit in a distributor's place for another couple of days. So you've had these bees that are all together for 4, 5, 6 days, and you put them in a colony and you separate them, and they kind of go, wait a minute, you know, we need to be back together because we've been together for 4 or 5, 6 days. That's not an uncommon experience. It's a pain in the rear end to fix, but you can fix it. And the way to fix it, you can fix it not easily, however. The way you fix it is that you hopefully you can find a queen, 2 queens. If you can't, which is often the case, you get yourself another queen, you shake the bees into your colony, and you take them someplace else. It's just like making a split, is that you have to separate them by some distance, a couple of miles, add a new queen, and they'll go right back to where they should have been in the first place. But the cause of that often is that you've got packages that have spent a lot of time together, and when you put them close side by side, they want to spend more time together. So You can fix it. It's like doing a split. It's a pain. Like I said, it's a pain to have to do it, and you're probably going to have to buy another queen.
Okay. Here's a question about they've got a strong colony in two, as I understand it, double deep. It's a colony in double deep 10 frame. A strong queen. Can they split this and allow the split to produce their new queen?
Sure, no problem at all. In doing that, the problems come down the line in all of the things that we talked about before when you let a colony raise its own queen. If you make sure that there are eggs in both splits, and I'll tell you why in a second, but you want to make sure that there's eggs in both splits so that the bees that have to choose to make a queen have the youngest larva possible, so that they have the best choice to make queen cells around, and then make sure that the colony is fed. The mother colony, the parent colony, make sure that you leave some eggs behind, because it's not uncommon. I'm not sure how common, but you want to make sure that in disrupting the colony when you make the split in the first place, something doesn't go wrong. You get the queen into your split by accident. You damage her. You disrupt the colony by smoking, and they ball the queen. Something happens that suddenly your queen in the apparent colony is gone too. And this way, if you've got eggs in both, you're prepared. But it's certainly easy to do and let them raise. But look at the timeline from egg to laying queen is like I said, 5 to 6 weeks. So if that's in your timeline, absolutely go for it.
Well, I keep going back to Dave Tarpey, who frankly I'm a big fan of, and some of his work with queens, and I go back to that talk that I just can't get out of my mind, which is probably a good thing, that he gave up at the Southern New England Beekeepers Conference or whatever it is, that basically what you're doing here is creating emergency queen cells, which means they're going to take any larva of acceptable age, in other words, between 1 and 3 days old, and try and raise out queen cells. And he's shown that queens raised from a 3-day-old larva are inferior, by and large, to a queen that's raised out from a 1-day-old larva. And so what you're doing is actually selecting for an inferior queen if you let them raise out emergency queen cells, because that queen that's raised from a 3-day-old larva is going to be the first one to emerge out, and she's going to go around and bump off all those other queens. She's going to bump off those the queens that were reared from the 1-day-old larva, and those are going to be the best quality queens. And so I'm not a big fan of letting them raise queens from emergency queen cells. Now, all that said, if you can't get your hands on a queen to actually install into a colony that's producing emergency queen cells, something's better than nothing. And sometimes getting a queen on short notice can be difficult. And so at that point, just let them run their course. But if you can, I try and avoid queens from emergency queen cells. Kim, you and I talked about this a little bit when we did our session here the other day, and I didn't think it would come up in our conversation this evening, but it has. You travel all over the place. You talk to beekeepers in just about every part of the U.S., and this is a question about the brood box setup. What configuration? Now, in the picture we've got in the background, you can see that these have this one's got 2 mediums. Now, it could just be one that we shrunk down. Honestly, I'm not sure when or what the circumstances were when this picture was taken. But what configurations, what general parameters would you put, in terms of the southeast, southwest, northwest, northeast, in terms of, in your experience in travels, sort of the preferred brood chamber configuration?
There's some conjecture here, because the question is, your question was, what is the preferred? And the preferred is if I am basically in by any definition that you want in the South, you will be told that one brood chamber, and I think you said it best now that you're in what I would call the South and having been in the Northeast, more than one brood chamber, you're raising bees and not honey. And that is an accepted axiom pretty much in much of the South. The further north you move, it gets into B2 right away. And that's the preferred. Now, what's best? Having not having a lot of experience keeping bees in the South, but having talked to people who do, they tend to tell me that using one brood chamber in the South works, but it's now, rather than 30 years ago, now it's harder to do because you're managing, there's more management involved with keeping bees than there was 30 years ago. So to some degree, I'm hearing that more people are going more to story and a half, a deep and a medium. And that gives them just enough room to do what they need to do. Expansion time of the colony is allowed to play out for treatments and all of the things that you need to do to keep bees in 1.5 as opposed to 1 anymore. But if I had to bet the farm on that, I don't think I would. I know that in the north it's 2, and it comes down to in the north you need enough honey to overwinter. The closer you get to the middle part of the country, then it becomes almost always a story, or often a story and a half. Again, because of the honey storage you need for overwintering. Get down to the far south, that honey becomes much less important because you've got foraging much later and much earlier than we do up here. So the honey thing is less important, but the management thing begins to take over a little bit. And there's probably half the people listening to this that argue with me right now, and I don't know that I would win that argument. How's that?
That was good. It was a little bit better than the stump the chump answers. When you and I were talking, it's no secret now that people that listen in know that I've moved down from the Northeast, and so I was running double deeps up there, and now that I'm in the South, and also in trying my hardest to convert from deeps to mediums, just because I like the fact that all the equipment, all the frames are standard size. I can take frames from my honey supers and rotate them down into my brood chambers to call out some of the older brood chamber frames. So I'm trying to do that, but in that process, of course, I've got just about every hive configuration you could imagine in my backyard right now. I've got double deep 10 frames, double deep 8s. I've got medium boxes, both in 10 and 8 frame, and so it's a real interesting little experiment. And certainly up north, I like the double deeps, or the equivalent would be 3 medium boxes for your brood chamber. And down here in the South, I'm finding that sort of close to a story and a half would be sort of a good brood chamber size. That's a good compromise between what you said earlier, which is raising bees or producing honey. Well, that seems to be a good fit for a combination of both. But a lot depends on where you are and what your priorities are, and also what your back will tolerate in terms of deeps or mediums. Because as I scrolled, after I asked you that question, I scrolled through, and there were a lot of questions in here about hive size and equipment pieces and etc.
One of the things I've found, Shane, is that for up north, I'm using 8-frame mediums primarily, and three 8-frame mediums works well as a spring, summer, fall brood nest, and I add a 4th in the late fall or in the fall for additional honey storage, and so I'm overwintering almost always in 4 mediums, and that seems to work well for me. But I tend to be generous with what I leave on for honey.
So hopefully that sort of mix of answers has addressed a lot of those questions. Kim, we've really gone way over here, which I appreciate because I know that you're exceptionally busy. and I appreciate people hanging in there. I hope people have benefited from it. I just want to ask you one last question, because there seems to be a couple of comments in here about some of that math that you were doing earlier on how to calculate the number of eggs per day that a queen is doing. And really that was quite intriguing to me. So I'm wondering if you could just sort of run through that real quick as our parting question, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Once you've got an established queen, and you know, you can define established any way you want, but at least she's been in your colony at least 21 days, and I would give her 28 to 30 days to settle down and to be in a kind of in a routine where she's producing a good number of eggs. But then do this over the course of the season. But what you need to do is the measure of eggs. Of course, proportion is the amount of sealed brood. You know, for every egg you have, eventually you have, or almost every egg you eventually have a sealed brood. So if you go into your colony tomorrow and you use those figures on cells per frame, a deep frame is 50 by 90 cells, so 4,500 on the side, 9,000 on a frame. A medium is 35 by 90, and those are averages for different manufacturers, but you can count your own and come up with how many you come up with. Given that, you go in and you estimate the percent of each frame that's filled with sealed brood only, that's all you're measuring. And if you've got, let's say it's about half, and of course it's an arc, and you begin to estimate, you can make yourself you can take a frame and with you and divide it into grids, and you know, just with fishing line, and which is what we used to do, and you can divide it into quarters and halves and all of those things. You can get as complicated or as simple as you want with this. You estimate the number of cells of sealed brood on day one. It's in your whole colony. On day one, you come back in 12 days, not 13, not 11. You come back in 12 days and you do the same thing again. You take the first number and you subtract it from the second number, and then you divide by 12, and that will give you eggs per day that the queen is laying. Now, of course, some eggs don't make it to sealed brood. There's some mortality involved in there. But if you do this 3 or 4 or 5 times, you'll begin to see how well your queen is doing. And there's always that mortality. There's always some hitches in your measurement, those sorts of things. So a one-time snapshot may be less informative than 3 snapshots over time. So I encourage you to do it more than once if you get the time and the opportunity. But you know, sealed brood day 1, subtracted from sealed brood day 2, divide by 12 eggs per day. There.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Again, we've gone way over here, which Kim, I really appreciate. Again, I know you're exceptionally busy traveling all over, editor of the magazine, talking with bee clubs, doing everything that you do for the industry. I really appreciate you taking some time out of your busy schedule to join us this evening, and I really appreciate everyone tuning in and asking so many questions, and apologize to all those that have questions here still that have gone unanswered. But feel free to contact us, and we'll do our best to get those questions addressed. That's what this is all about, which is getting information into the hands of the beekeepers, you guys, so that you're better at what you do, and hopefully make the experience that much more enjoyable. So Kim, thank you very much. I truly appreciate it. And everyone out there, thank you, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Shane. I appreciate everybody listening, and have a good season.
Thank you. Good night.